Namaskar, this is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. The war is worsening. The Russians are pounding Kyiv. It's being called a quote-unquote exceptional attack. Ukraine is striking back deep inside territory held by Russia. Zelensky has new weapons and he's not shy of using them. So where is this heading? We'll discuss. Meanwhile, Pakistan is threatening to boycott the Cricket World Cup in India. Guess they have a thing for self-destruction. In the US, they're close to a dead default. I'm talking about the US government. It'll be the first ever in their history if it happens, but President Biden says he's optimistic. In Fiji, the Prime Minister has said sorry to Indians. We'll tell you why. In Germany, there's a tough message for China. Shut your secret police stations. We'll discuss Beijing's response. And in Japan, people have taken off their masks, but they've forgotten how to smile. And they're paying money to smile coaches to learn again. It's for real. The headlines first. Large-scale corruption ring reportedly exposed in Ukraine's Supreme Court. Its Chief Justice has been held in a $2.7 million bribery probe. The European Union has made fighting corruption a precondition for Ukraine to join the body. South Africa's army chief visits Moscow. His trip comes just days after US accused it of supplying arms to Russia. South Africa says it's simply a quote-unquote goodwill visit. At the invitation of the Russian army, President Cyril Ramaphosa did not deny the US charge while promising an investigation. Japan and China make their first call on a defense hotline. The hotline was launched in March after years of negotiations. It aims to avoid unexpected clashes in the East China Sea. Cyclone Mocha devastates Myanmar. More than 40 people dead in the Rakhine state. The persecuted Rohingya community lives in these worst-hit villages. Mocha was the most powerful cyclone to hit the area in more than a decade. Vodafone's new boss announces massive layoffs. The British mobile phone giant will cut 11,000 jobs in the next 3 years. Vodafone will be axing over 10% of its global workforce, the biggest job cuts in the company's history. And the bitter truth about artificial sweeteners. The World Health Organization advises against using them. It says these sugar substitutes do not help you lose weight. In fact, using them could increase the risk of diabetes and heart disease. We start with the war in Ukraine. Day 447 of this war. On most days, the story remains the same. More violence, more deaths, and a bitter war of words. But today is different. Today, Russia launched a fierce attack on Ukraine. These were aerial attacks. They targeted the capital, Kyiv. Ukraine too is attacking Russia, and it's striking deep inside Russian-held territory. The intensity of the fighting has increased. So has the urgency. They seem to be fighting to the finish. The question is this the beginning of the end of this war? Let's start with the Russian attacks on Kyiv. Last night, Russia stepped up its aerial attacks. A barrage of missiles was fired at Kyiv. This happened at 2:30 a.m. local time. Emergency sirens were activated. The city was woken up. Soon, loud explosions were heard. The sky was lit up by large flashes of light. These were Russian missiles being neutralized by Ukrainian air defenses. It was a tense night for Kyiv. Consider what one of the foreign diplomats said. This is the British ambassador to Ukraine, and this is what he said. A full-on aerial attack on Kyiv last night. Pretty intense. Bangs and shaking walls are not an easy night. Hope everyone is okay. Reports say Russia attacked Kyiv from 3 directions: the north, the south, and the east. Russia fired at least 18 missiles from land, sea, and the air. Also, 6 Iranian Shahed drones and 3 reconnaissance drones were pressed into service. So Russia went after Kyiv with full force, but it failed to inflict much damage. As of this afternoon, no deaths were reported. At least 3 people were injured. So what was the purpose of this attack? Reports say Moscow wanted to destroy Kyiv's air defenses. Ukraine uses the US-made Patriot air defense systems. They arrived a week ago. They were supplied by the US and Germany. The Patriots have enhanced Ukraine's defenses, and that's what Russia is trying to break through relentless air strikes. The objective is to weaken Ukraine before a larger attack. What about Ukraine's response? Well, they too are intensifying attacks. Today they struck deep inside Luhansk. This is a city in the east and it's in Russian control. Ukraine used long-range missiles for the strike, and this is the first time Ukrainian forces have done this. Earlier, they did not have these capabilities. They couldn't strike targets that were far away, but now they can. And their targets are command and control centers of the Russian military. Moscow has issued a statement about this. It says Ukraine is deploying British-made Storm Shadow missiles and that Russian forces took down at least one of them but missed others. The Kremlin has also issued a threat.
The reported British supplies of long-range missiles will require an adequate response from our military, who will consider the relevant decisions from a military point of view.
So Russia is threatening a response. But the new weapons give Ukraine a clear edge. They could shift the course of the war, at least in the skies. Earlier, Russia had the edge. Now Ukraine has neutralized it. It has new missiles and weapons. It can reach most of the occupied territories in the east, even Crimea. That was annexed by Russia in 2014. Zelensky has the weapons and he's sourcing more, and he won't be shy of using them.
We are returning home with new military help, newer and more powerful weapons for the front, more protection for our people, greater political support.
In 3 days, he's visited 4 European capitals. He's managed to secure significant military aid. Let me show you the list. The most significant package comes from Germany. It includes another 30 Leopard tanks, 20 armored fighting vehicles, 16 air defense systems, and more than 200 drones. Also a range of other arms and ammunition. France and Italy have promised to send tanks, ammunition and air defense systems. The UK too has pledged more aid. Their package includes hundreds of air defense missiles and more armed drones. Why such an aggressive push now? Why is Zelensky being given so many weapons? The Western powers, for a change, seem to have clarity on what they want. They want Ukrainian forces to reclaim more land, to push the Russians back and to secure their gains. The idea is to get more leverage on the battlefield before any peace negotiations can begin. So for Zelensky, it is now or never. If he cannot secure sizable victories now, he risks losing support from the West. Because frankly, no one has an endless supply of weapons and money, and no one wants a forever war. We are counting down to the Cricket World Cup in India. It's just 5 months away. Last time India hosted it, we won the whole thing. So this time, expectations are huge, but so are controversies. Pakistan, for one, is threatening to boycott the tournament. First, listen in to their cricket board chief.
I'm not worried about the Asia Cup. It's the World Cup. And India should not be looking at a situation where we end up boycotting the Asia Cup and also the World Cup. And then India ends up boycotting the Champions Trophy. There'll be a huge mess.
Why is Pakistan threatening a boycott? Because India has refused to play in Pakistan. There's another major tournament scheduled before the World Cup. That's the Asia Cup. It's slated for September and Pakistan is hosting. But the BCCI says India will not go. No prizes for guessing why. Pakistan's security situation is still bad. More than 430 terror attacks were reported until April. Total casualties, more than 850 people dead and injured. So naturally, the BCCI is wary. You see, the men in blue are not just a cricket team for us. They represent a lot more. They're India's global ambassadors. So sending them to Pakistan is a huge risk. When India objected, Pakistan came back with a plan. What if Team India's matches were played elsewhere, perhaps in the UAE? The other teams could still play in Pakistan. Well, no luck so far. Sri Lanka, Bangladesh and India have rejected this plan, and each for their own reason. Which brings us to the World Cup in October. Pakistan wants to play tit for tat. They say, if you can't play in Pakistan, we won't play in India. And what is the BCCI saying? No official statement so far, but from the looks of it, they won't budge. Not unless the ICC decides to intervene. That's the International Cricket Council, ICC. Now, what do we make of this Pakistani threat? Are they serious or are they bluffing? Just look at what's happening in their country. Until last week, the BCCI had just one worry, and that was terror attacks. But now there's a full-blown constitutional crisis in Pakistan. You have protests, you have crackdowns, and you have tanks rolling on the streets. Pakistan cannot handle one ex-cricketer. Can they really handle dozens from India? Seems unlikely. The fact is, Pakistan's security situation is not acceptable. Certainly not for Team India to visit. So what's the solution? Maybe the ICC can broker some deal, perhaps convince India to play its matches outside Pakistan or simply pull the entire tournament from the country. And that's the big worry for Pakistan, really. If they lose hosting rights, they also lose a lot of money. How much money are we talking about? Around $3 million. So Pakistan needs the Asia Cup. They need the revenue more than the actual trophy. It's unfortunate for Pakistani fans, but they should know who to blame. Their own politicians and generals. Time for a short detour. Do you know why Pakistan doesn't host major tournaments anymore? Because of what happened in 2009. The Sri Lankan team was attacked by terrorists. 6 of them were wounded in the attack. It was after 2009 that cricket left Pakistan, and now we are told things are different. That Pakistan is safe again. I can tell you what the stock arguments are. Sri Lanka toured Pakistan in 2019, England toured in 2022, Australia also toured in the same year. But here's a question. Does Pakistan sponsor terror attacks in Australia? Does it claim sovereign English territory? Does it send terrorists to attack Sri Lankan cities? I don't think so. They're capable of it, but they haven't really done it yet. But India has suffered all of it. So the Australian team may feel safe in Pakistan, but an Indian team will not, especially the most powerful and popular team in Indian sport. That's one part of the argument. The second is linking politics and sports. A lot of people will say, don't do it. Don't link politics and sports. But how many of them have a neighbor who uses terror as state policy? I guess none. The last India-Pakistan bilateral was played in 2012-2013. Pakistan came to India back then. The year before that, in 2011, India hosted the World Cup. Team India played Pakistan in the semi-finals. Former Prime Minister of India, Manmohan Singh, invited the Pakistani Prime Minister to watch the match. You may remember these pictures. It was called cricket diplomacy. Let's go even further back. To 2003-2004, the Indian team travelled to Pakistan. This was just 4 years after Kargil. It was called a big diplomatic gesture. But what did India get in return on all these occasions? Betrayals and more terror attacks. You see, the idea of linking politics and sports is not some outdated and narrow ideology. It's happened throughout history. And India has a valid reason to do so. Why make money for the Pakistani Cricket Board? Why give lucrative IPL contracts to Pakistani players? And don't get me wrong, this is not about punishing the Pakistani public or their players. This is about putting a squeeze on the top bosses. It's much like how sanctions work. So Pakistan would do well to get its own house in order first. Perhaps figure out how to deal with their raging captain before hosting neighbours. This is a tale of two economies. One is a superpower in decline, struck by political paralysis and staring at a default. The other is an emerging power with a decisive leadership and the world's fastest growing economy. I'm talking about the United States and India. Both countries are major economies, but they exhibit a stark contrast. I'll tell you how. And we are starting with the United States of America. For the first time in their history, the US could default on its debt. The government is running out of cash. The budget is being held hostage by political divisions. I'm talking about the US debt ceiling. And we've discussed this before on the show. The US government is about to hit its borrowing limit. Their only option is to raise the cap, to raise the debt limit. Right now, it's a little over $31 trillion. May sound like a lot of money, but it isn't enough for them. Team Biden wants to increase this limit. The opposition is not on board. And that is why America is close to a debt default. They have an odd system in place. The government cannot just borrow the money it wants. It needs the approval of the Congress. And that involves convincing the Republicans. But they're playing hardball.
So no, I don't think we're in a good place. I know we're not. This ignoring the problem, thinking it's going to go away, he could bumble his way just into a default like he did on the border.
That message was for Joe Biden. The Republicans are supposed to meet the president tomorrow, and he's running out of time. He must strike a deal within 2 weeks, else the U.S. could face international humiliation. For the first time ever, the U.S. could default on its debt. The U.S. Treasury has written a letter to the Congress. What does it say? It says Washington has time till the 1st of June. If the debt ceiling is not raised till the 1st of June, there will be a default. So the risk is real. Wall Street is preparing for the worst-case scenario. Banks, brokers and traders are making plans. They fear a default will disrupt the market. So they're building cash reserves. They're planning how future payments can be handled, and they're preparing contingency plans. Now let me underline this. We are talking about the world's largest economy here, the US economy. A few months ago, some of their banks collapsed, and there was a ripple effect across the world. Imagine what would happen if the US government defaults. A new crisis is certain. It's hard to predict how bad it will be, but President Biden is optimistic. He says he can reach a deal.
Look,
their position and where
what I've learned a long time ago, and you know as well as I do, is never as good to characterize a negotiation in the middle of a negotiation. I remain optimistic because I'm a congenital optimist.
Well, we wish him well, but the fact is his government is being held hostage over the budget. Compare this to India. No such crisis here. The economy is doing much better. Inflation is under control. There is no policy paralysis. In fact, the Indian economy is now driving global growth. Let me show you an assessment from Morgan Stanley. It believes India will contribute 16% of the global GDP. 16%. Let me quote from that report, in fact. India's strong growth outlook stands out as the best among large economies, and we forecast it will contribute 16% to global GDP growth over 2023-24. And what's working in India's favor? If you go by the report, it lists a lot of positives. Strong domestic demand and rising services export. The economy has largely recovered from the shock of the pandemic. Again, I have some numbers. GST, or the Goods and Services Tax collection, has increased by 35% from pre-pandemic levels. Services exports have increased by 84% since October 2020. Passenger vehicle sales have also shot up by 131%. Again, this is an improvement from before the pandemic. So India has not just managed to bounce back, the Indian economy is in fact performing better than before. The point we are making is simple. These are times of economic uncertainty. Every day there are reports of job cuts. Not too long ago, there were predictions of recession. At a time like this, while India is driving global growth, the US is adding to global worries because of their domestic politics. Qatar could soon have a top job at the United Nations. It's been nominated to lead the ILO, that's the International Labour Organization. Think of it as the labour police. They protect the rights of workers, they suggest reforms, and they also prepare reports on various countries. Next month, the ILO will hold its annual conference. A new chair will have to be nominated there. Reports say it will be this man, Saeed bin Samik al-Mari, the Labour Minister of Qatar. And his name is controversial, I'll tell you why. Imagine you have a UN body on rebuilding Ukraine after the war. Would you nominate Russia to lead it? Of course not. Now imagine there is a United Nations body for Uyghur protection. Would you nominate China to head it? I'm assuming not. Now this move by the ILO is no different, because Qatar's treatment of labourers is notorious. Think back to last year's FIFA World Cup. Do you remember all the controversy around it? Reports said 6,500 migrant workers died at construction sites. They died building stadiums, roads and hotels, but Qatar has not even acknowledged it. Even before the World Cup, their record was poor. No right to strike, no right to organize, no right to demand higher wages. They also had something called the kafala system. It's basically a sponsorship. A company would pay and house migrant workers. In return, they would have complete control over those workers. Their passports could be taken away. Even changing jobs required the employer's permission. This was almost like forced labor. On paper, Qatar has abolished the system, but reports say it is still prevalent. And yet, Qatar has been nominated to lead the ILO. What explains this double game? In one word, money. I'll recount two cases for you. The first is from 2017. Qatar gave $25 million to the ILO's Doha office. What for? To run a labour reforms program. Now, countries donating to the ILO is not new or unusual, but $25 million? That's not a donation, that's a bribe. Speaking of which, Qatar is directly bribing government officials as well. Look at this headline. Member of European Parliament denies Qatar bribery after €1.5 million seized. In November, this politician defended Qatar's labour record. 1 month later, she was arrested. So this has been Qatar's policy. Use petrodollars to bribe and lobby abroad. That's how they got the 2022 World Cup. That's how they could lead the ILO too. In December last year, the organization's chief visited Doha. He was all praises. He said there was progress on health, safety and working hours. Now let's be clear here. Qatar's labor laws were at rock bottom. There was only one direction to go, and that was up. But should the ILO be cheering and endorsing that? Well, they did. And it set the wrong precedent. In June, Qatar's lobbying will be tested in Geneva. That's where the ILO will meet. The organization may have nominated Qatar, but the members must approve it. If they do, it will be an institutional failure for the United Nations, and it won't be the first. In 2020, China was appointed to the UN Human Rights Council. Their qualification? Jailing 1 million Uyghurs. In 2022, North Korea led the United Nations top disarmament group. What was their qualification? Lobbing missiles, I guess. What do these examples tell you? There's something inherently broken in the United Nations system. If you have money, you can circumvent it, like how China did with the Human Rights Council or Qatar with the ILO. But such appointments will have long-term consequences. A, they will erode trust in the UN or whatever is left of it, make it a laughing stock. And B, it will set back socio-economic progress. There is still time for the ILO to change course. Let's see what happens at their June summit. Have you heard about India's Look East policy? It was unveiled in the 1990s. The idea was quite simple: to reach out to Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia or the Philippines or Thailand. But now there's a new question facing the Indian establishment. Should India be looking even further east? Where does that take us? To the Pacific. And why are we talking about this now? Because of two events. One, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's upcoming visit to Papua New Guinea. He'll be meeting leaders of 14 Pacific Island nations. And two, because of an apology from Fiji. We'll start with the last one, the apology from Fiji. Fiji's Prime Minister recently apologized to Indo-Fijians. For what? For a coup he organized in 1987. Back then, Fiji had two major ethnic groups: the indigenous Fijians and the Indo-Fijians. Now, the Indo-Fijians trace their ancestry to India, and they make a sizable chunk of the population. But in 1987, that changed. The military persecuted the Indo-Fijian community. More than 70,000 of these people were forced to flee the country. Now the Prime Minister says he's sorry.
To err is human, to forgive divine. Today, I, Sitiweni Lima Mandarumbuka, on behalf of those who were with me in 1987, ask for your forgiveness and pray that God will grant you the serenity, the power to forgive us. God bless you all.
As they say, time heals everything. Fiji's relations with India have improved recently. Prime Minister Modi visited the country back in 2014. He also announced multiple projects for Fiji. So why the apology now? Maybe because Pacific countries realize India's potential, which brings us to Prime Minister Modi's Papua New Guinea visit. Historically, this area has not been New Delhi's focus. Why is that? Because India is not a Pacific country. The focus was more on the Indian Ocean. New Delhi has just two resident missions there in the Pacific, one in Papua New Guinea and the other in Fiji. So just two missions in a region with 14 island nations. There was a lot of policy neglect and inertia. I'll give you an example. In 2014, India started a new forum, the Forum for India-Pacific Island Countries. The first summit was held in Fiji in 2014. That's what Prime Minister Modi attended. The second was held in Jaipur in India in 2015. And the third will be happening later this month in Papua New Guinea. Do you see the gap? 2 summits in 2 years and then absolutely nothing for 7 years. The obvious question is, what has changed now? Why is the third summit happening now? Because of India's Indo-Pacific policy. You can't be an Indo-Pacific power by limiting yourself to the Indian Ocean. You need a foothold in the Pacific as well. This region makes up 20% of the Earth's surface. It is home to several key trade routes. It could also become a front line in future conflicts. Let's rewind to the Second World War. The US and Japan fought most battles in the Pacific. Plus, we're talking about 14 countries here. Big or small, that's 14 votes at the United Nations. Important. So India's interest is understandable. But that's not why New Delhi is suddenly pivoting to the Pacific. That would be because of China. In the last 2 decades, China has invested heavily in the region. Their end game is this: to replace the US as the major Pacific power. That's what China wants. As always, the West was late to realize. And now they're rushing to make up. President Joe Biden will also be in Papua New Guinea along with Prime Minister Modi. Washington is trying to build an alliance there. In the month of March, Japan announced a plan to invest $75 billion. Now it's India's turn. Reports say multiple deals will be signed. When Prime Minister Modi is there, they'll cover small and medium industries, easing travel restrictions and cultural exchanges. The Pacific Islands are apparently interested in two very specific things: capacity building and disaster management. And India excels at both. Plus, New Delhi brings fresh perspective to the region. No colonial past, no World War hangover. India can be a trusted partner of the Pacific. The conditions are certainly there to force a lasting partnership. Let's see what happens on the 22nd of May. Now let's tell you about Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, better known as Europe's last dictator. He's been in power for almost 29 years. He's an ally of Vladimir Putin. Of late, he's been in the news. Why? Because he's been missing from the public eye. There's a health scare. Opposition parties in Belarus are on alert. They're readying for his fall. Russia, too, has expressed concern. But today, there was a plot twist. Lukashenko made a public appearance. The Belarusian media released a video of him at a military command base. He appeared a little weak, though. His hand looked like it was wrapped in a bandage. But the 68-year-old seems to be alive. Our next report tells you why his absence caused frantic speculation and what his re-emergence means.
Alexander Lukashenko. He's the president of Belarus, the country's only president, actually. He captured the presidency during its first ever election in 1994. This was after the USSR broke up and Belarus became an independent nation. So Lukashenko has been president for almost 29 years. But over the last week, there was speculation that the dictator had fallen. Lukashenko hadn't been seen in public since May 9th. That was during the Victory Day celebrations in Belarus and Russia. It's to celebrate the victory of Soviet forces against Nazi Germany. Lukashenko was in Moscow to attend the parade, but he seemed ill. He skipped a dinner hosted by Russian President Vladimir Putin and disappeared from the public eye for a while. There was a cautious sense of optimism among Belarusian opposition parties. Supporters were told to be prepared for anything, because if Lukashenko was truly out of the picture, there was hope for change. Lukashenko has famously been called Europe's last dictator. It's a nickname he has used himself, and it's quite accurate. He's done everything you'd expect from a dictator: abolished presidential term limits, allegedly rigged elections, threatened and jailed political opponents, even reportedly made some of them disappear. He has cracked down on pro-democracy protesters with an iron fist, with the Belarusian security establishment serving as his own personal enforcers. He's also had a close relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin for years. The Kremlin expressed concerns in the wake of reports about his health. As speculation grew, Lukashenko re-emerged. Belarusian state media came out with this footage earlier today.
Давно не ходила, да? Дороги нет, лес не убран, так и правильно? Работу после зимы. Какой зимы? Это уже осень скоро. Группа деревьев случайно это не валяется у вас гнилые, уже третий год. Не знаю, маленький городок, его уже можно в порядок привести за одну неделю.
The media showed Lukashenko berating military officers, quite on brand for the purported strongman. The media also released this footage.
3 days after the events near us, I mean in the Bryansk region, when 4 aircraft were shot down and we were forced to respond. Since then, we, our troops, have been on high alert. So I'm interested to know about the situation around the country. And of course, the direction and perspectives of the development of this situation.
That statement could serve to prove that the video is recent, because he's talking about an incident in Russia from a few days ago, when 4 Russian aircraft were shot down, most likely by Ukrainian forces. This happened on Saturday. So the opposition can't claim that Lukashenko's video is old. They can't say it's some old message that has been released to mislead the public. His re-emergence is a setback to them. Their plans of political change will have to wait. Russia, on the other hand, will be pleased. Putin's old ally is still around, and one of Russia's neighbors remains friendly. For the Belarusian people looking for democracy, they'll have to wait a while longer. Europe's last dictator hasn't fallen yet.
To Germany now, Berlin is quite annoyed with Beijing. Why? Because of China's secret police stations. They're still operational, though China says they're not. It said it shut down such facilities in February. Also, China doesn't call them secret police stations, it calls them service stations. Either way, it assured Germany that such stations had been closed. So Germany decided to check, and it found that China was lying. The Interior Ministry spokesperson has issued a statement. Let me quote from what has been said. The security authorities continue to assume that there are 2 so-called overseas police stations in Germany. How do you think China responded to this? With another denial. The Chinese embassy in Berlin has issued a statement. You can see the translation on your screen. Let me give you the highlights of this. These volunteers are simply dedicated overseas Chinese, not Chinese police officers. There are also no so-called police stations or overseas police service centers. These voluntary offers of support have been discontinued. We can expect that the German side will deal with this objectively and leave no room for further speculation. There were also the usual declarations of China respecting international law and sovereignty. Now, China would have you believe that all of this is harmless, that these stations have no sinister agenda. They're just outposts to help Chinese citizens abroad, but no one's taking their word for it. The world sees these stations for what they really are, centers to intimidate Chinese dissidents. They're set up in areas with a sizable Chinese diaspora, and they act like Beijing's dirty work departments. They perform tasks that are too shady for diplomats, like tracking down dissidents, intimidating them to go back to China. And there are many such people all over the world. Those who opposed the communist regime and had to flee China. Those who had politically motivated cases against them. Those who face arrest on trumped-up charges in China. Such people try to make a life for themselves in other countries. Many of them leave their families behind in China, and that becomes their weakness that Beijing exploits. They force dissidents to return, and they threaten harm to their families. And it's all done through these secret police stations. China runs them all over the world, hundreds of them. The first reports about these came out last year. Many countries woke up to this fact. They decided to take action. Last October, a German spokesperson made a bold declaration. I'm quoting again. The federal government does not tolerate the exercise of foreign state authority, and accordingly, Chinese authorities have no executive powers on the territory of the Federal Republic of Germany. It's been more than 6 months since, but China's secret police stations are still around. How? They've apparently gone mobile. Yesterday, a spokesperson said that the stations are, quote-unquote, usually not fixed stationary offices, but mobile facilities. So basically, Chinese intimidators on wheels. How lovely. This adaptability is why countries are struggling to shut these stations down. When under the scanner, the secret Chinese police stations just up and move. And according to the US, they also purge their data. Last month, we told you about 2 arrests. 2 Chinese secret police officials were arrested in the US. On what charges? Obstructing justice by destroying evidence of their communications. Basically, erasing the data. You see how it can be difficult to dismantle the insidious Chinese operation. Yesterday, Germany publicly rebuked China, and as usual, China denied any wrongdoing. Until countries find a way to tighten the screws, Beijing will keep on meddling in their territory. The Spanish have an expression, April will bring the rains. That's the English translation, of course. No matter which language you say it in, though, this year it proved to be wrong. In April this year, there was no rain. In fact, this April was the hottest and driest one on record. This March was Spain's second driest in 100 years. I can go on, but you get the idea. Spain is suffering a drought. Experts are calling it a mega drought. It has come with an unusually early heat wave. The result is this: water shortages, skyrocketing food prices, farmers fighting for their survival. What's worse, Now, Spain is on the path to becoming a desert. 75% of the country is already in the process of desertification. Here's a report.
Spain is dehydrated. It is running out of water. And this has become the country's biggest crisis. A long list of reasons is behind this. The biggest one is its drought. It was long and painful. A mega drought, according to experts. Spain saw an unusually warm winter and a sheer lack of rain. 30 consecutive months recorded below average rain. This was followed by hot months. They consecutively hit record temperatures. And now there's a heat wave which has come earlier than expected. Now combine all these factors. They will lead you to Spain's depleted reservoirs. They are drying up. Some of them are at less than 25% of their capacity.
The summers are getting longer and longer, and of course, evaporation takes its toll, and also there is this strong drought that we are not used to. The fact that it just rained for 2 days in 2023, everything has conspired to create the perfect storm.
A perfect storm indeed. One that is hot, dry, and is drinking up all of its water. This is obviously hurting Spain on multiple levels. The country is called Europe's back garden because it exports a large chunk of what it produces. But now, agriculture is taking a hit, so farmers are the first to suffer. Their crops are dying. 60% of their cereal crops have dried out. The cultivation of key crops like olive, almond, and pistachio have also taken a hit. Thousands have lost the means to their daily bread.
Spain is experiencing the most severe drought in recent years after the last one in 1993. 30 years have passed. This time, it is even more severe than the previous one. More than 60% of Spanish farmland is being affected by the drought. There is uncertainty in the farming sector due to the lack of water for irrigation and because of the chaos this is causing, as we don't know if we will be able to save our crops or whether the trees will be able to survive.
The suffering of farmers has also become the country's pain because the prices of food are soaring and people are unable to afford basic things like olive oil.
The price of edible oil has risen significantly. Fruit prices are also climbing. The price hike of all edible oils is very crazy. Overall, all the prices are going up.
As if these problems weren't enough, Spain has a new disaster in the making. It is slowly turning into a desert. 75% of the country is going through desertification. The country's climate is changing and people are struggling to cope. They are protesting. Thousands are holding processions to pray for rain. And the government is scrambling to take action. They have imposed new policies. But at this point, it all feels like too little, too late. For decades, Spain has overexploited its groundwater, 80% of which is attributed to farming. It didn't take enough measures to curb the damage. And now, climate change has made everything worse. They urgently need to adapt to this new arid climate and rethink how they use water. If they want to act, the time is now. Because the desert sands of time are slipping through their hands.
You've heard of life coaches, I'm sure, or career coaches. But do you know about smile coaches? They are specialist smile tutors and they've become all the rage in Japan, especially in the post-Wuhan virus era. 2 months back, Japan lifted its mask mandate. You don't have to wear a mask in public anymore, which should be good news, except that the Japanese have forgotten how to express it with a smile. After spending almost 3 years behind masks, their facial muscles have become a bit rusty, it seems. People say they've forgotten how to smile. So now they're paying tutors to teach them how to smile. I'm not making this up. The next time someone says, you can't put a price on a smile, tell them about this. Because Japan's smile coaches charge up to $650. Here's a report.
It takes 43 muscles to frown and only 17 muscles to smile. But that's easier said than done. Introverts will probably relate to this. But what's happening now is not limited to them. We're talking about the Japanese. They've been concealing their mouths for 3 years now, covering their faces with masks, all thanks to the Wuhan virus. But this March, their government relaxed the mask rules, so the Japanese people became free to roam around without masks. But this didn't really relax them. In fact, it had the very opposite reaction. Because with the mask off, their emotions lay bare, so they are now trying to put smiles on their faces. Except instead of beaming grins, they are breaking into awkward smiles, some of which are completely fake, and others simply look pained. We're not kidding. The Japanese are really struggling with their smiles. They're failing to adapt to a life without face masks. Some say they have completely forgotten how to smile. Others say they try to smile, but their facial muscles are rusty. Some have even developed a complex about it. They feel awkward about their smile. So they're looking for solutions. They want to relearn the art of smiling. And believe it or not, there are people who specialize in helping them. We're talking about smile coaches. Japan has hundreds of them. They're specialist smile tutors who are teaching people how to smile. They have become pioneers of an odd business that is surprising the world: smile education. These tutors want people to devote time to smiling, to do it consciously and do it more often. They now have thousands of students who pay about $650 each to regain their smile. For them, this course is totally worth it, and that sounds believable. Smiling is good for both physical and mental well-being. It helps people live longer by relieving stress, boosting immune systems, and reducing blood pressure. Plus, social contact is the key to good living, and facial expressions are the key to social contact. The Japanese know this. They've even inculcated a culture of laughter yoga, much like in India. But due to social distancing, they seem to have forgotten the basics. So the Japanese are participating in smiling studies. They're learning how to relax their facial muscles and training them just as they train their body muscles. They're holding up mirrors to check their progress, and a lot of them are coming out of these classes happy customers. And why wouldn't they? After all, they spend hours smiling. These classes are a hit among Japanese women, but these classes aren't just for retail customers. Companies like IBM are holding smile training sessions for their employees too. And nursing homes are hiring smile tutors for their elderly residents. We know this sounds odd, hiring a tutor and paying to relearn something as basic as smiling, but maybe there is an upside to this. Maybe we can all learn a bit from the Japanese. Along with leg and arm days during our workouts, maybe we can also incorporate smile days.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. We're starting with Sudan. A fire broke out in the city of Omdurman. This is where intense battles have been fought between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary troops. In Italy's Pompeii, 2 more victims of a 2,000-year-old volcanic eruption have been found. In Peru, an anemic, malnourished and hypothermic sloth has been rescued. And finally, taking you back in history, what makes the 16th of May significant? On this day, the so-called Cultural Revolution was launched in China by communist leader Mao Zedong. The year was 1966. Mao wanted to assert, his authority over the Chinese government and the people. He felt that China was headed in the wrong direction. He wanted the so-called impure elements of the society to be purged. In the months and years that followed, elderly and intellectual people were attacked and harassed. Millions of people, were killed. Many were tortured and imprisoned. We're leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
la protezione, quella cosa fondazione.
Esa es la entrada, la que sería...
Email exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony.
An Indian becoming a UK PM.
Well, it's not like that we are going to get the Kohinoor back. But at least India is on its way to the top. Huh?
But Gautam sir, there's actually not much to celebrate.
Why not? An Indian is ruling the UK.
Indian leaders in third countries often tend to overcompensate for their minority handicap.
Key.
For example, Sunak's Home Secretary of Indian origin, Suella Braverman, disapproved of India-UK free trade because it would encourage people immigrating to the UK, and the majority of whom were Indians. Structurally, India and UK have passed baggage, but still hasn't been resolved. And that is why...
Ladies and gentlemen, India needs to significantly temper its expectations from Rishi Sunak. Presenting Vantage with me, Palki Sharma, a first-of-its-kind global show with an Indian perspective.
Mismanaged vaccination drive, broken healthcare systems, citizens taking matters into their own hands. India's failure in managing the COVID-19 crisis is staggering.
Want stories but without the West spin on it? Presenting Vantage with me, Palki Sharma, a first-of-its-kind global show with an Indian perspective.